I'm really pleased to be here. I haven't been to CHCI since 2013, when I also did sort of a budget thing more about the university. I'm really impressed with the institutional work that everyone in this room is doing. I mean, it's not only because institutionalists are my people, although that does help. And what I'm going to say here, and I think is compatible with what Caroline just said, is very much in the spirit of continuation and expansion. In other words, not plopping something on top of what you're doing to move it aside, but to build on the great things that are already happening. It's very much in the spirit of what we've been talking about all along. I mean, I also just want to say up front that I do believe that humanities scholarship is self-authorizing and intrinsically valid. So I'm not an instrumentalist in the sense that I don't think it's worth doing unless we can fix A, B, and C. But I do think that, I mean, I think about this partly in the context of directing a research foundation that operates in the social sciences. So I'm not actually in a humanities center. And what it's done is it's refreshed my sense of the vulnerability and the fragility of humanities knowledge, you know, because I can see with the 10,000 assessments that I read in the last 3 years, coming from the social sciences, the difficulty that they have seeing how what we do fits directly in with the agendas of this foundation, which are actually quite compatible with most of the projects that we're pursuing in this room. It also has refreshed my sense of the importance of the humanities as the missing links in all sorts of projects, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So, I mean, I really like to reverse this fragility, and I'd like to do it partly through partnerships, that without neglecting or setting aside the deep work that we have to do within our own domains, historically and in other ways. So I think, in other words, I think we can really have it all, but we have to really aggressively pursue having it all. And that's more or less what I'm going to be talking about. There's also something that Sara raised indirectly, but which is always the elephant in the room in these kind of discussions, which just has to do with the fact that our fate is really in the hands of public perception of us, and we need more control over that. I had, for odd reasons, I was a co-PI on a NSF engineering grant for 5 years, and what I saw with them is their absolutely daily labor of trying to have control over public perception of them. And it was budgeted. They had massive amounts of funds for manipulating public perception, or, you know, influencing it. And starting with their deans, starting with other people's deans, you know, they would be hegemonizing Sara if they were up here pretty much, you know, actively and enthusiastically, and not fraudulently, but it, you know, through the kind of belief, the same kind of beliefs that we have in our own work. And so I learned quite a bit about how that succeeds. And I'm thinking about this also in the context of the conversations about sovereignty that we've been having. Jennifer Ho mentioned this yesterday, and then Dr. Sakatopoulou was talking about a kind of sovereignty in a couple of sessions ago, in full awareness of sort of non-preservationist elements of ourselves. And I also feel like that's part of the strategy and also the ethics of being in the humanities today, is the kind of change that is going to be a bit painful. And some of the pain will involve looking at budget figures, which we're going to do in a second. Okay, I actually, in spite of the absolute catastrophe that surrounds us when we look at every direction, in any direction, I also feel this, that we're cultural scholars and we're living through a cultural revolution, and it's a massive opportunity for us. And I think there's actually multiple revolutions that are happening slowly but surely, and the question is, what kind of participation are we going to have in them, and how are we going to steer them? So I'm thinking Black Lives Matter, anti-Asian hate, Me Too, indigenous rights movements, indigenous environmental, water protection, land protection movements are all trying to reject endemic forms of aggression and coercion in everyday life, and are pointing towards multiracial societies in historically, you know, white nationalist lands in which interpersonal relations are not dictated by coercion and superior power. So there's a lot coming out of that. Israel's war in Gaza has broken a 50-year paradigm and 50 years of discursive rules around Israel-Palestine, and I think it's going to change the Middle East over the next 10 or 15 years positively. It will change U.S. foreign policy. It will change U.S. domestic politics. This is an anti-war protest movement that is demanding accountability regarding the almost casual use of war as an international solution and the entitlement to violence, to state violence. Again, I think we don't know how it's going to turn out, but it's going to be enormously important. And then the third, and this kind of gets to the topic that I share with Caroline, the economic culture has shifted under Biden. He has moved away pretty decisively from neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has been bad, as you know, for wages. It's been bad for labor. It's been bad for professional labor. It's continuing to be bad for that. It's been bad for knowledge work and craft work. It's been bad for pretty much everything that comes out of universities, with the possible exception of don't fundraising, right, because of the concentration of wealth that it has accelerated. It's also been very bad for the humanities because it's induced an obsession with return on investment in the pecuniary sense, which is higher in technological fields, whereas on our side, we are higher in non-pecuniary benefits. And these have been made invisible by a regime that I think that Biden, and also in his strange way in 2016, Donald Trump, has helped to dislodge. And I think that's part of this. We're seeing just massively larger awareness about the dangers of fossil capitalism. So on the one hand, we've lost 50 years, because we did actually know about this in the 70s. On the other hand, there's a urgency and intensity around it that continues to build, and a desperation about the fact that the 2020s, which were going to be the sort of the green defossilization decade, is turning into a war decade. So there's a lot of folks that are absolutely opposed to this, and on the one hand, it looks really bad. On the other hand, there's counter forces that I think that we need to be part of supporting and expanding and enhancing. And so my question is, how much input do we have? How much capacity do we have to intervene pretty directly in the course of the public discussion? And my standard is not, when I ask this kind of question, is not the media, it's not social media, it's just other academic fields, which are, I think, fairly comparable to us. And the big one that I think about a lot is economics, because they control climate policy, and the economics of education has just had a massive effect on the funding, the financing, and the prioritizing of different activities within universities as well. So we haven't really kept our eye on that. But so the question is, why are they doing well? And then how can we do as well, or actually better, in getting our ideas and understandings of things into common understanding? And so I think that, so the question is, do we have the capacity to intervene for the sake of majors that Sara was talking about, for the sake of academic labor, and for academic jobs for our PhD students for which they are training, and not alt-ac jobs? The answer absolutely has to be yes. Yeah, and there's quite a few things that have to be part of that, including a theory of non-pecuniary benefits, but I don't have time to go into that. What I think that I want to do is just give an example of a novel and some issues that it raises as a way of thinking about the kinds of questions that are being asked that we need to be involved in. And then I want to ask, what infrastructure does it require to get involved in this? And then where are we in terms of funding in relation to actually providing that? And I thought this would take 15 minutes, but it might take a couple minutes longer than that. Apologies to. Okay, so Kim Stanley Robinson, he wrote this novel, The Ministry of the Future. I imagine if you in this room have read this book. So as you know, it starts with a mass death event, which freaks out the entire planet. There is then a flurry of very intense activity, a lot of serious reflection on what technology do we already have, and also what social arrangements do we have, and how do we rearrange those things so that we can use the technology that we have to actually fix all this. The UN sets up a ministry for the future, but then politics as usual returns. The deaths are not really happening with the same frequency. Memories are short. And change goes back to about 1/5 the speed that's necessary to actually deal with anything. Okay, so There's a research question in this novel that I would paraphrase this way. Why do people pretend not to know, especially when the thing that they're pretending not to know has just killed millions of people? And they just are, how do they manage to forget? And then Robinson also at another, in one particular interesting scene, summarizes a related questions. Why do governments and corporations do things to ameliorate the situation they were falling into after it is too late for those things to succeed? And I mean, this is kind of, it's a psychoanalytic question as well as a cultural one, as well as an interpersonal relation question. Why do we do too little too late, always? And how have we gotten this far, you know, being like that as our default? Okay, so Robinson is literature's biggest research fanatic, so his novel explains a whole range of solutions. There's a carbon coin currency, as you know, there are new institutional forms, there's a whole new economics that starts to develop out of this. So technology is being marshaled on this massive scale, but at the heart of the novel sits this question that the technological fixes are not really answering, and in fact, they're to some extent distracting attention from, and that is, what is the psychology of change that would actually work? What is the culture of change? What are the cultural forces? How do people change? You know, we were talking about this in the second to last section. How do you risk yourself to the extent that you actually become something else and you can think other thoughts and you can act in different ways? Okay, so the initial candidate for this transformative force in the book is terror, right? So the questions attached to this is, will transnational corporate CEOs act only when some of their colleagues have been killed in targeted assassinations? Do the heads of global agencies need to have their homes invaded by people who force them to answer this question correctly? Why do you pretend not to know? And you know, one of the survivors of the mass death event is this person, Frank, who puts himself in that position and does invade the home of the head of the Ministry for the Future. And through this act of basically terror, by terrifying her, he gets her to think, oh crap, I do know, and so I must act on what I actually know. So we have this slightly reformulated research question from this book. How do we get elites to admit that they know and to act on that without the resort to terror and to war? In other words, this green decade that's turned into the war decade, how do we back out of that and actually do the green version of it that Caroline was talking about, without it being coercive, top-down, north destroying south, vice versa, et cetera. Okay, so the elements here are exactly the kinds of questions that literary and cultural studies have been working on forever, basically. And in the last 40 or 50 years, I mean, certainly in the time that I've been aware of this, there's just been massive progress within our disciplines. There's been the production of a word that I try not to use in our fields, of findings, of research outcomes, you know, the kind of stuff that other fields put into papers and consider to be results of research. You know, we discovered this stuff, and here it is. And it involves, you know, everything from transformational identity politics to interactions between literary studies and economics to basically all the things that all of you work on in this room. Okay, so there's all this great stuff. Where are our understandings in discussions of global policy? And I'm afraid the answer to this question is kind of nowhere, right? Like, economics are still being looked to, having massively failed in 2008, massively failed to produce environmental knowledge that we, you know, of the kind that we need at the time that we needed it. And yet they're still pretty much in the driver's seat in terms of deciding how policy needs to be shaped. Okay, so my comment, or my response to this question of why are we nowhere, is not because of our ideas, but because of our infrastructure. So we get to this question, why humanities infrastructure? And for me, the simple answer is that we need it in order to make contributions to each other's knowledge. So this is internal communication, but also to then do external communication on climate. So this is a list that I just patched together, which in discussion we could no doubt improve, subtract from, change, whatever. But here are a few candidates of things that basically have to happen. One is inventories of climate literature findings, that vulgar word. They're going to be contemporary, but they're also going to be historical. So classicists are as relevant to this as people working on 21st century fiction and Kim Stanley Robinson. They will involve findings about how people change, how groups change, what are cultural turning points. What's the moment in this book when it actually becomes possible to imagine transformative technology being applied as opposed to simply being around waiting for the right return on investment. Research meetings. So here's Caroline's first word. We have these once a year meetings, and we really enjoy them, and then we go away for a year. Or, no, I don't just mean us, I mean it's sort of a standard humanities model. They need to be actually routine, they need to be massively more intense, they need to be ongoing, they need to involve all this stuff, developing ideas together, resolving conflicts, refining methods, affirming a certain kind of professional validity. Again, we're pretty uncomfortable with professionalization for political reasons that all of us know. And here's Caroline's second word in her infrastructure chapter, which is enclosure. Certain enclosure of authority, the establishing of the authority of the disciplines, the multidisciplines, however we talk about it. We don't really have that so much right now. I mean, Sara would be a completely prudential dean to rest her claim for faculty FTE on the basis of enrollments and workload, while other divisions are probably, especially if their enrollments are slipping, leading with the importance of their research and the interest in outside funders in that kind of research. And it will help if we are also in that position. Methods in our theory articulation, which I feel has slowed down in the last 20 years or so. I think it needs to be sped up, again, as a self-learning process as well as something that we teach other people. And then here's Caroline's third word, pathways. Development of a research program or programs. So we're right now talking in the singular in relation to climate change and the climate emergency, but we could also identify 15 different humanities research programs within that, each of which needs to be articulated, supported, and elaborated in various ways. So it would be national scale collaboration, really international, because it's an international problem. Again, in the way that NSF funded people, NIH funded people operate routinely. And then continuous research collaboration at scale. So there's one paper and then there needs to be 100 more papers on the same subject. And if you looked at citation analytics for other fields, you know what I'm talking about with that. And there's a kind of a scaling up issue. The social sciences are really leery of individual cases as meaning bad sampling. And if you look at the way that, say, the New York Times covers the MAGA base, they go into the diner and they talk to a few folks who love Donald Trump, and it's just really not the way to figure out if he's going to win the presidency or not, or even to understand what people think about him. So there's a inbuilt suspicion of case-oriented folks, and I think that is something that needs a lot of collaborative work on. And then the construction of archival publication and dissemination platforms. We basically need a National Bureau of Economic Research for Culture, so like an NCER, to match the output that 100-year-old organization, as well as translating the results of its specialized papers into languages that other people can understand. So they hire journalists to do that kind of work. And everything has to be 5 times faster. It's the title of a book by Simon Sharp, 5 times faster. That's what we have to do to prevent climate change from being even more catastrophic than it already is. And it's basically the same thing that has to happen with our research. And it's exhausting even to think about because you're all, I think, pretty much at the limit of your endurance, and we're still working at a pretty small scale. Okay, so this is where you come to money. And I'm going to end with these kinds of slides that I love to show. What it takes to sustain stuff like this is core funding. In other words, it is not about the opportunity to apply and write grants to other people who may or may not give you their money, and especially if there's a 10% acceptance rate or a 20% acceptance rate. That's not funding. That's supplemental stuff. All this humanities research is on that slide needs to have an institutional base. It needs to have centers. It needs to have staff. It needs to have, another, to use this word, infrastructure, because that is the only thing that allows the sciences to apply for the grants that then bring in the other money that allow them to do particular kinds of work. The University of California had heard about this in the humanities starting in about 2005 from me and other people, and it's just been fingers in the ears, and I think it's now reached a, I don't know, kind of a quasi-catastrophic state. Okay, so the majors in the whole issue, that whole issue is outside of my scope here. I would make the argument that majors come to vital research fields, that 18-year-olds understand which fields seem to be moving in a direction of helping the world and which ones seem to be kind of on the sidelines. They see it, the Nathan Heller piece in the New Yorker found all sorts of undergraduates that had a very clear sense of where the university is investing its money and took their cues about importance from where the money was flowing on their campuses. So let's, it's not on my computer. Let's take a look at a few of these. Where do I have to point this? Oops. Can you advance it? Cool, okay, thank you. Okay, so this is federal research expenditures, and the top, the yellow line, which you can barely see, is life sciences on this slide. The next one down, which is quite a bit further down, is engineering. The green one below that is physical sciences. The fourth line down is all non-science and engineering bundled together, so that's the social sciences, education, law, a whole bunch of stuff. And then the very bottom lines that are flatlined pretty close to zero are us. I mean, it's not the most shocking thing. Okay, here's what happens at this university. This is UC system-wide data that's prepared by the Office of the President. Research expenditures by discipline 2020, so they divide it up slightly differently from the NSF. And these are just taken directly from their website. I didn't prepare these. So medicine, you take medicine out of the life sciences and you see the life sciences go way down to where the other sciences are. And then again, at the bottom you see professional disciplines, law being a good example of that, and then the arts and humanities combined into the same line, again, pretty close to the bottom. It rounds to zero, essentially, what the university's total expenditures are in this. Okay, and the next one, this is the same university report, the accountability report 2 years later. Similar pattern, do you notice what happened? The arts and humanities got deleted from the research expenditures report that the Office of the President of this university produces. So we're basically just gone. Okay, and then the, oh, there we go. This is just looking at the NEH versus the NSF. The point here is not only that there are 2 orders of magnitude difference in all of the numbers, with it, you know, the NEH, humanities having to work at 1/100th, so again, 1%. It's that, you can't really see this from this very well, out of $207 million the NEH spent in this year, and I think it's 2023, only 17 million of it about is classified as research programs. And if you throw in digital humanities and some other stuff, you can stretch it to maybe 30 million, so about 12% of the total NEH budget goes to what we would consider to be research, and the rest of it is essentially re-granting to states, to humanities councils. All worthy stuff, but not actually research. NSF spends $8.5 billion just on research and about another billion on education and administration, so it's a much smaller fraction of that stuff. Okay, and so here's a slide that I think is especially important for us when we think about the sort of the net funding that we get from our institutions. So there's this thing, all right, so the governments are not really helping us, but what about our own universities? So our universities are getting a whole bunch of money from the government, so maybe they could use more of that money to help out the humanities because they know the NEH budget as well as we do in the NEA budget. And so they will use institution funds, as the NSF calls them, to spread, to redistribute a little bit, right, and help us out. Okay, so what you see here are research expenditures by major funding source, which identifies the amount of money that comes from different places. The blue at the bottom is government. I sort of assimilated some of these. The green at the top is our NGOs, so foundations, think Gates, think Mellon, as well as corporations, which mostly goes into STEM stuff. And then the gray bars in the middle are institution funds. So if you look at Berkeley, this institution spends on the left-hand side $210 million of its own money. And at public universities, that comes primarily from student tuition and state revenues on subsidizing research. And then you can see the other numbers. Irvine spends about $115 million out of a smaller total. There's two very wealthy private universities in there, Princeton and Stanford. The University of Michigan spends $612 million of its own money on subsidizing research. And the University of Oregon, which is a smaller operation and has, partly I think because of its geographical isolation, has less business and sort of other grant money coming in, spends $55 million of its own money. Okay, so that's a lot of money though. Let's just like sticking with Berkeley, that's $210 million. And if humanities researchers can't get money from the extramurally, because there's not that much out there, why not get it from the inside? And so here's what that looks like for these same universities. It only seems to show when I back it up. Okay, I'm sorry, this is really hard to read. That gray middle bar is now the green bar. So those taller green bars are the total amounts of internal or institutional funds that are being spent by these 6 institutions in these quite different cases. And so we have the same order. And then the amount of money, the bar to the left of each of the green bars is all non-science expenditures stacked together. And what you're looking for in the humanities is the orange bar in the middle of the shorter one on the left of each of them. And what you see are really tiny amounts. I mean, just to pick on Oregon, because I think Jenna has left. They spend 1/55th of their institutional funds on the humanities, even though they have the Oregon Humanities Center, which is really quite a great thing, and it's a pivotal institution for that state. The same goes with the other schools. Sorry, I'm just pulling this up on my own screen so I can actually read the numbers. Berkeley, 4.3 million. That's a lot of money, but it's a very small fraction of 210 million. Right? I mean, if you're just going for percentages. In fact, I will just read this off. The share of the internal funds that go to the humanities, Berkeley is 1.9%. Irvine is 6.1%, which is the best public case. Princeton spends 10.6 of its internal funds on the humanities. Oregon spends 1/55th, as I mentioned. Michigan spends 4% of its internal funds, and Stanford spends 0.2% of its internal funds on the humanities. Okay, so here's my conclusion from these slides. We live in a permanent state of infrastructural poverty. So we do get grants, we do get gifts, we do get funds from the provost and from the dean here and there. But the structural situation is simply not in the same league, it's not in the ballpark of the knowledge producers that are essentially controlling the discourse, we're talking about narratives, on the issues, in this case, climate emergency, that we are concerned about. Here's kind of my final point about this. I mean, part of the problem is them. Part of the problem is that we are really good sports. We suffer quietly. And so I guess the call that I would issue at this point is that we really have to break the silence. And we have to get ourselves into awkward and risky positions in relation to our own administrators about the fact that they are absolutely screwing us and screwing our ability to do the kind of work that we need and that the planet needs in order, in the case of climate, to even survive. And I think one of the starting points of that is being able to mourn openly the loss of infrastructure, to be able to be candid about the disrespect that's part of this, to be able to face up to what's killing us, to see ourselves not as victims, but as targets of a kind of epistemic injustice that actually our institutions, in spite of all the problems they've been having, do have the means to solve. So I don't mean this as a berating anyone, but I think like time is really running out, and confrontation is the only way that we're going to move this forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So I think we have about half an hour left. What I want to do is give Caroline a chance, if she wants, to respond to any of this. And let's start with that.
I actually had one just really small thing that I wanted to say to bring Sarah's points and Chris's points together, which, Chris, you said, why do we always, that one of the research questions of Ministry for the Future is why do we always respond too late? And, you know, that's a haunting question for me. One of the things I found, though, is that we don't tell the stories about when we respond in time. So the ozone layer is one example, right? Where actually governments came together and solved a problem. And now my students don't know anything about it because we don't tell that story as a victory. Yeah. And as a result, we don't have a model of things going well every so often. And I think it's particularly hard with preventing bad things from happening. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious whether, to use that to respond to you in more robust ways, whether that's, you know, is there a story we could tell that would say, you know, you redistribute this money and we look like we do in 1965, or are we really imagining something else that's different from something that once was? What story are we telling?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
We're not telling a story about how it was better before, for sure. Like this is not. It's about having to build for the first time the capacity for cultural knowledge that we need to fix a whole bunch of problems, including the other social problems of inequality, racism, and the rise of authoritarianism, you know, post-democratic forces, et cetera, that are also affecting and interacting with climate. So it's not that. It's just I completely agree. We have to tell the positive stories. What I'm concerned about is we can't afford financially, in the most material sense, to do anything other than the case method. And that leaves us, first we do cherry picking, because it's depressing not to. I mean, it's totally understandable that we do that. And then secondly, we try to offer this up to other disciplines that just have a different sense of the structural forms of knowledge in which this would have to be fit. We don't have the money to analyze the ozone the condition and turn it into something other than an anecdote. How do we write the novel of that? How do we write the 30-page story in which we find the forces that allowed the world to come together around that particular set of chemicals to fix it? I once tried to do this with German solar, and you know, I could identify, in fact, the social forces that freakishly allowed that to happen in the wake of the reunification of Germany, you know, in which Bavarian farmers and post-communist Eastern European environmentalists got together from opposite sides of the spectrum and sort of went around the backs of the power companies that were all scrambling to capture Eastern European resources and weren't paying attention. So what's the version of the ozone story? All I'm saying is like I had an NSF grant to do that work, which is what allowed me to actually find all the stuff, the 100 bits of that story, not just the 5 bits of the story that I would be able to find on my own, and calling other people, hiring translators because I don't speak German, et cetera. So completely agree with you. We just need an infrastructure to make good on exactly what you're talking about.
So, Caroline, I have a question for you, and I have a question for Chris, and I'll warn you all that I'm then going to go to all of you, so start to think of what your questions are so that there's not a long lag. My question for you, Caroline, is really about the classroom and the Humanities Center, just because you have this audience of Humanities Center directors, and we're talking about like what happens within a classroom versus what can happen within a Humanities Center or institute. And I'm wondering if you've thought a little bit about, or can reflect a little bit about, the kinds of interventions that are possible through the Humanities Center or Institute. Which is a little bit different than my students are interested in this and they're feeling despondent and how can I help them, or even your workbook at the end of the book when you turn it back to the individual reader. What happens in the center that's distinct?
Well, yeah, I mean, such a great question, and I would want to turn it back to those who run humanities centers because I have not done that. But it seems to me that so many of the ones that I have known of have themes and organize speakers and resources around an idea or a concept or a problem. And one of the things that a year-long theme does, I think, is to, where did I read about the fact that science grants are often the wrong length, like 5 years is the wrong length for studying certain kinds of things, right? That it might be the wrong length for some of these your issues and questions. And so what would a 5-year theme look like? And could it include kind of the building of collaborative units and projects? They include undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, and faculty in a way that the current ones that I know of, the humanities centers that I know of, aren't doing. Would that be a different kind of knowledge gathering just based on the length of the theme? I do think we also could argue, I am welcoming the argument of whether climate justice really should be the theme. And it seems to me that it should be the theme because all of the other things that we care about are under it or connected to it. I don't want to say subsumed in a way. So it wouldn't be that 5 years on climate justice would mean no attention to racism or ableism or democracy or historical method. It would mean that those would all be kind of joining around this problem. So the piece that I don't know about and would love to talk to all of you there about too is just whether there could be a knowledge to action framework for us. So we currently kind of really resist that, right? And other fields do have that knowledge to action. Often social science essays end with, here's what the policy could look like, or engineers certainly end with what the new thing could be, right? And what would that look like? Could we organize humanities research, at least experiment with a knowledge to action?
Yeah, I think there are a set of questions that open up there around we talked about walls yesterday, we've talked about boundaries. When do the humanities begin and end? So when are we humanities policy organizations, humanities think tanks, and when we turn to policy and inform policy, is there something in humanities insight and in humanities methods that is foregone? I mean, I don't know if you're attached to the humanities or not. I mean, you're you're attached to the humanist activists, but are you attached to the humanities, or are you attached to a form of intervention for which the humanities might not look very distinctive from, the object might be distinctive, what you're reading or maybe even reading, but is there still a line between the humanities, the social sciences, and engineering? Is there even one now? I mean, I do think that porosity is something that you're introducing and that might be productive for all of us to think about. Then I have a question for you, Chris, but it sounds like you want to intervene here.
Well, I just wanted to say to Caroline, this is where the platform comes in, the system, the infrastructure. So we don't really want our colleagues to change in the sense that they become policy thinkers, because that's not what they do, that's not who they are. So in spite of what I said a minute ago about how we do actually have to change ourselves by taking risks, and we are going to be doing that. The thing about these collaborative systems that are funded at the, we had, and this is for a topic of nanotechnology in society, we had for 5 PIs, $1.2 million a year for 5 years in 2005 dollars. And we had $150,000 set aside for communication and engagement. And so we did, in fact, hire a journalist to write the policy stuff or to rewrite. And we just at my foundation have hired a subset of the Conversation publication to, instead of editing our scholars into conversation type articles, writing the summary of their articles for them and publishing them on our website. So it's the collaboration, I think, will make it much easier for people to stay who they are, work to their strengths, change a bit to do the cluster and the structure, but get the multiplier effect of everybody working together through these systems that honestly most other disciplines have already. So we don't have to reinvent this wheel. It's not a magical thing. We just have to fund and then build the stuff that has been working pretty well for other disciplines since at least World War II.
I think that's super important, Chris, that because we work in the aesthetic humanities, many of us, or as historians, and are called upon to be people who are understood to be communicators, does not mean that we need to be our own communicators. And I just think that distinction, that assumption that we're always communicating in a certain voice. Now, your argument's a little bit different, Caroline. I mean, you're kind of arguing for community in which we ourselves are our own communicators. You're, I think, Chris, arguing that, do our research in its intricacy and in its obscurity and in its specificity, and create the conditions under which others will communicate on our behalf, hire them. And those are two different positions for how the humanities get into the world, and they're probably both right.
Yeah, they're both right.
But actually remembering that both are possible is something that, because we tend to live in austerity conditions or in a position of scarcity, that we don't think that we could actually have access to someone who would communicate on our behalf, that we just have to change the way that we communicate to be more transparent, more accessible, more familiar. So I did have a question for you about, Chris, what if your numbers are wrong? What if you're actually looking at the wrong things to look at research in the humanities? And it's possible that graduate fellowships is how humanities research is funded. And if we're not looking at graduate fellowship allocations, then we're actually not really and that's not to say that we're not living in a position of scarcity and that, of course, we need more money. We certainly need more money, and there are many, many reasons for why research needs more money. But I wonder if it's possible to become more precise about what research in the humanities looks like, and whether things like graduate funding or university presses are ways in which humanities, our research is funded, that don't get captured when we're only looking at certain things. And it's something for us all just to think about, and we can talk about that later. I want to make sure there's time for other people to ask questions, but it's something that's on my mind when we look at the numbers.
Yeah, just one sentence about that.
Yeah.
I seem to have lied about the 20 minutes. I'm really sorry about that. But this is really going to be one sentence. Oh, I already undid that. Sorry.
We'll never trust you again.
the numbers will be much better if we can overcome administrative omerta about the numbers, right? So yeah, these are not complete. They're absolutely not complete. But the drill down detail and also the distributions within universities are considered to be proprietary, basically trade secrets, and don't circulate. So I got started by being on my planning and budget committee where I had non-circulating data, and then I knew how to ask questions and get more. But if universities had administrators that worked with faculty and with center directors and with chairs and just said, here's the books, here's the issue, you figure out a better way of distributing it. What are your ideas? We would be able to, A, get a more complete picture, which we absolutely need, and then secondly, have better flow into the questions that we share with so many other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that understanding what we mean by humanities research, and each of us are refiguring that in our own institutions. Like, is it now collaborative? Is it digital? What the cost is today is different than what the cost might have been 20 years ago. I mean, I do think, is it global? Does it involve travel? Like, these are all things that we don't know how to quantify ourselves, let alone our administrators, or we haven't yet created the metrics. So, one invitation would be, what are the metrics by way of which we would be able to start to talk about the real costs of humanities research, because it's not the same as what a medical school is. And when you look at Michigan, that's a university with a medical school. Like, what medical research is actually quite different from what most of our humanities research is, even when it's on climate and at scale and with engineers and everything else. Questions? I'm sure there are many. Amanda Anderson has one over there. And then David Shumway back there afterwards. So yeah, first Amanda, then David.
So thanks so much, Caroline and Chris. It's great to have you here and to have read your work. My question is for Chris. I've thought for a long time you are a national treasure, and you're also an international treasure. But I am going to press on something here. I'm grateful for everything that you do, always, seriously.
You're so nice.
I'm thinking about your use of the following words: knowledge, findings, discoveries. So you're very clearly taking the language of the sciences and the social sciences and applying it to how we should talk about the outcome of our research. And you're probably aware of these cultural analytics, what everyone says, and the Alan Liu project, which look at all of these different media outlets and show that when humanities research is discussed, say, for example, in any number of campus newspapers, the words findings and discoveries are used for the sciences, but when the humanities are discussed, everything is mediated typically through an event. Somebody gave a lecture on, somebody gave a class on, so it's always mediated, and it's not presented as a finding. It's presented as an experience, actually.
Yeah.
And that has everything to do with the cultural authority of the humanities, which is something that you're really trying to change, and so some of this is sort of strategic. But it strikes me like, is it distorting what humanities work is? And this has already come out a little bit, right? Is it casting the humanities more as a social science? And I ask this in part because it seems to me that despite your references to let 1,000 flowers bloom humanities scholarship, that you have a concept of unified knowledge. And that you're kind of saying, we're in a position where if we put together our understanding of history, culture, psychology, change, if we put all of that together, we can produce a unified knowledge that will get us to a post-imperial and post-technocratic society. To put it really bluntly, it sounds a little bit like Soviet realism, okay? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah,
I mean, but
guilty.
seriously, the other thing I thought reading it, and I'm really sorry, before I came up with Soviet realism, was Cultural Revolution. But there is this sort of, we did all these things, we figured out all the terrible things about power and society, and we can answer a populist cultural demand to address these terrible things about power and society, but we have to kind of, work together, routinize things, and build this unified knowledge that we then, roll out. And so just tell me I'm wrong about that and why.
No, you're right. No, I've gone from the village sociologist of English to the Soviet realist of the humanities. I would like to make a T-shirt. No, the caveat is that I completely believe in anti-foundationalist knowledge and anti-positivistic structures in what we do. And it's the reason I was a science undergraduate, until my senior year. And the reason I got out of it was philosophy of science, and what I could see was a completely different epistemological formation that got at cultural, social, psychological issues. Yeah, and I copped to that integrative thing, where they all work together, and it's in novels. And where else does that actually happen? It certainly doesn't happen in the American Journal of Sociology. So I think that it is 1,000 flowers in the sense that only a few people are going to do different parts of this. It's really about the setting up an infrastructure that allows us to bring this stuff together. And there could be a unity point for public consumption way downstream from the actual thinking that we're all doing, so that thinking is not corrupted by positivistic pseudo-knowledge. But there is going to be a bit of positivistic pseudo-knowledge, at least in the checking of, for example, the economics of the environment. That desperately needs to happen. Simon Sharp needs the help of the humanities in order to do what he's trying to do, which is defeat neoclassical economics of climate change. And so it's more expensive to maintain our intellectual integrity and to keep us doing what we're doing in the way that we are, while at the same time projecting it on a mass scale so that it's visible and effective.
So I think David, and then Carla, and I can't see who's back. Kelly, maybe? Amanda, sorry, I actually can't see that far.
Thank you. I really enjoyed reading both of your papers again for this occasion, and I find them both quite persuasive. I think their implications are somewhat more radical than especially Chris seems to want to allow. And this is a follow-up to Amanda in a slightly different direction. It seems to me that the implication of both of your thinking is a much less individualistic humanities, that we would need to work together much more cooperatively on a much larger scale. We would have to sacrifice our own desire to do peculiar or particular research in order to support social projects that the humanities really do need to contribute to. So this is not that the humanities need to be something else. The humanities need to be the humanities, but they need to be directed, what I take from both of your papers, towards particular ends that they have not been directed to.
Thanks. Carla, I think. Oh, right. Sorry, Caroline. Go ahead.
I was just, thank you, David, for that question. I'm just wondering, this is going to come out sounding like an odd response, I think, but I think it would make us happier if we were collaborating with a common purpose. I actually think a lot of us are attached to our peculiar rabbit holes. It's not that I don't think that that's true, but I think that part of our sense of feeling, I just feel a tremendous malaise around me, even at one of the best funded English departments in the world. I feel this sense of a lack of real excitement about the projects that we're working on. And I think it's partly because we're not working together. And I think we would get a charge out of feeling like we were making a difference by working together and giving up a little bit of that autonomy, not in a, you know, top down, not necessarily Soviet way, although I have a strong place for Soviet realism in my heart. But I do think we'd be happier.
Soviet, but not Stalinist.
1, 2, 3. We only have 5 minutes, but we're going to go. Why don't we take all 3 questions and then get a response, if that's okay? So, Carla and Bev, 4. Okay, we'll take 4 quick questions. I think Carla's back there. She was first, then Amanda, then I don't know your name, then Alex. Here, we can, if one of you just wants to grab, you can probably toggle to be more efficient for the next one.
Thank you. I had one comment and one question, but I'll drop the comment and just go straight to the question. This is for Chris, and really I'm just curious about a concrete example that you have in mind of ways in which to engage the model of and collaboration with the social sciences, because in my previous role for the last almost decade, I must have interviewed hundreds and hundreds of economists for academic positions. And I can think of about 3 examples of economists who were reading the work outside of their field. They value the top 5 econ journals. The growth is in econometrics and modeling. And though we are working on many of the same critical issues of climate and racism and war, we do so in ways that economists look at race as a variable. And they're not engaging with our research. I went to the SSRC meetings last year and heard presentations from all of the major funders, the National Science Foundation, but also Carnegie and Rockefeller and Sloan and all of the major foundations, and they are funding in large grant dollars, millions and millions of dollars, work that they define as critical for the future of humanity, collaborative, and quantitative. That's what they valued. And I was sitting at a table with 1 or 2 humanists, and we were kind of gasping because even humanistic social sciences, anything resembling something like as fuzzy as ethnography, was nowhere to be seen. So this is a genuine question. I mean, I couldn't agree more that we do need collaborative models, but give us an example of ways in which to reach across and find interest among the economists to work with humanists.
I'm trying to get 4, so go.
No, I have an answer to this, which is the residential research group. We had a fellowship in 2018 at CHCI, and I really hope this program is not defunct. 2 economists, 3 geographers, 4 humanists. We spent 20 hours a week in meetings together for 11 weeks, and at the end we co-authored a book. So we picked the right economists, they were open to it. We had to argue about everything, and at the end we collaborated. So it's the process that does that.
4 minutes. Amanda, sorry, I turned this off. Amanda, and then right here, and then Alex.
Hi, I'm Amanda Swain from the University of California, Irvine, where apparently we have 6% of our research expenditures in the humanities. Yay. And I actually want to say very practically about infrastructure, and I think how we have that number is that we learned that there are very special budget accounting designations and account numbers that are rolled up into research expenditures. So we make sure that when we get our state funds, student tuition funds, particularly those that are coming through the Humanities Center, where a lot of these research funds are then being expended, that we take them out of accounts that are labeled as general funds, and we move them into an account that is labeled as a research expense fund, and then we pay anything that is research out of that account number category, so that things are rolling up as research expenses. And you know what? that makes our vice chancellor of research very, very happy. You know who gives money to the Humanities Center at University of California, Irvine? The Office of Research. So it was like a very simple thing that once we discovered it, infrastructurally, we have been able to do something that has made a significant impact.
Great.
I should have done this. Oh, it's on. Yay. Okay, so on the topic of effective models that we already know about, Chris, you talked about how our existing work and sort of poverty in the system keeps us from taking on more risk. And Caroline, you talked about how we need to throw more effort into translating knowledge to action, but we don't have necessarily the resources to do that because of all the other work that we're doing. So the only way to shift efforts in a workplace setting, of course, is to collectively set terms for our own work. So I'm thinking about to what extent both of you think about labor issues as connected to the things that you're talking about now. Can we solve this through collective bargaining, maybe formations that we haven't used or tried before as like an entire entity of academic workers? Thanks.
Yeah, great question.
Last question, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. So you ended your talk, Chris, with the word confrontation, and I would like to think more collectively about that. Confrontation, who, what, where, how? How can that be effective alongside persuasion and communication? In terms of communication, maybe what we all need is a Substack that we can share, that we can collectively contribute to. I mean, we can have professional communications people who put our work out there. We can also learn how to do elevator pitches and, you know, kind of fairly, let's say, less complexified renditions of our work and share them with people. So, but I like to think about what modalities do you think we can use, and especially in the digital environment, to get some of this work across and not have it just bounce around in a humanities echo chamber. And then finally, I mean, I think there's actually a lot of collaborative work going on. There are carceral ecology labs. I've been running a lab for 10 years that is NIH funded, that has tons of humanists. I think there are many ways of doing this, and you know, NSF has STS. A lot of humanists do STS. They might not realize it, but they're doing it. And so I think at the next event of this or similar, I mean, I've been to some of these. We need to have more. We need to have a panel that talks about collaborative research and talks about results, as well as basically like nuts and bolts. How do you put this together? How do you do a funding pitch? And how do you do all of the pieces that you need to work often what it is kind of in a virtual format if it's multi-institutional? So I'm all for that, and I would be happy to participate or bring in people I know to participate in that going forward.
That's great, thank you.
Thanks. Our time is up, but a minute each of you to have last words.
No, last word to Caroline.
Caroline? But you're muted. Is that possible?
Thank you. Just on the question of labor, I think one of the most exciting things that's going on right now is the rise of labor organizing. And labor organizing with climate organizing is incredibly exciting. There's lots of cool work going on, including the, is it called bargaining for the common good? Organizing for the common good? I can't remember. Anyway, that's where it's at.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just put one last plug. You know, if those of you who are here days ago and we talked about CHCI initiatives, I mean, that is an emerging platform from within the organization that ties together many of the things we've been talking about here. So the collaborative, the more action oriented, any one of the themes that we've been talking about, I think have the potential over time to be sites of global collaborative research that has the potential to shape worlds outside of the smaller ones in which we already know that we live. So thank you to both of our panelists, thank you to the questioners, and thanks to all of you.